Studies Section 13. International Trade and Balance of Payments. Introduction. Nigeria, like every other countries of the world, is part of the international economic system where interdependency and relationship thrives. In this studies section, you will be exposed to the reasons for international trade as well as the pains and gains therein. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study section, you should be able to explain the size and growth of foreign sector in Nigeria, discuss major trade policies commonly used in Nigeria, examine the effect of trade policies on Nigerian balance of payments, size and growth of the Nigerian foreign sector. The ratio of import and export to the gross domestic product is a crude but widely used index of the size of a country's foreign sector. Judged by this index, the Nigerian economy appears to be characterized by a large foreign sector. In 1970, for example, the measure of the size of the foreign sector was 32%. This increased to 47% in 1980, 62% in 1990, and 68% in 2000. And in 2004, this shows that Nigeria is highly dependent on international trade. Moreover, the country's degree of openness is on the increase. This degree of openness of the economy, although not as large as some African countries, has grown over the years. This growth is reflected in a rise in the size from 20 to 32% between 1950 and 1970 and stability to as much as 68% in 2000. As a result of the tremendous importance of oil in the country's exports, Nigeria is now one of Africa's most trade-dependent economy. Structure of Nigerian economy. The Nigerian economy experienced a radical structural change in the 1970s and 1980s. These changes were particularly significant in the external sector of the economy. For instance, agriculture was the important sector of the Nigerian economy in the 1960s. It provided the largest share of the country's gross domestic product, GDP, employment as well as export earnings. The situation changed dramatically in the 1970s as crude petroleum became the economy's leading sector through the importation the economy from 16.3%. In the 1960s, agricultural products constituted the bulk of Nigeria's commodity exports. With the advent of oil in commercial quantity in the 1970s, the share of agriculture in export earnings has depleted to an unbearable low levels. From 81.94% in 1960, the share of agricultural products in export earnings decreased steadily to 29% and 4.6% in 1970 and 1975 respectively. In 1980, it further declined to 2.4% and by 1995, it fell to less than 2%. Up till date, the percent has remained less than 2%. The fortune of mineral products, mostly crude oil, its export earnings, on the other hand, improved tremendously from an extremely low percentage of 2.6 in 1960 to 25% in 1995. It also increased to 58.55% and 94.7% in 1970 and 1975 respectively. The contribution of crude oil in Nigeria's export has remained above 95% since 1980, thereby rendering other commodities highly insignificant in the export basket of important interest in the structure of Nigerians' export if the near 0% level of manufactured export between these periods. In other words, Nigerian exports have been dominantly primary. This primary-oriented export base portends great implications for both the value added of such exports and the vulnerability of the economy to external shocks. The composition of Nigerians' imports since independence remained almost the same as that of exports except for a few changes that are noticeable in its contents. Four products jointly constitute the bulk of Nigerians' total imports. These are food, live animal inclusive, chemicals, manufactured goods, and machinery and transport equipment. Together, these four constituents of import are responsible for more than 85% of total imports. Within this major product, some fairly remarkable changes can be identified over the historical period, from a level of 7.6% and 8% in 1970 and 1975 respectively. The share of food and live animals in total imports increased to 15.8% and 17% in 1980 and 1985 respectively. It however declined sharply to 7.66% in 1990 due to the protectionist policy in form of outright ban of some food items. The share of chemicals in total imports that stood at 7.5% in 1975 steadily increased to 19.7% in 1990 and 22.9% in 1999. A major contributor to the increasing share of chemicals is the importation of refined petroleum products since the late 1980s due to the underutilization of the installed capacity of the refineries in the country and their closure in some cases. The share of manufacturers in total import remains virtually the same between 1970 and 2005, ranging between 22% and 30%. Question: what do you think was the major change that has taken place in the structure of Nigerian economy? Question: what do you think was the major change that has taken place in the structure of Nigerian economy over time? Feedback: the most noticeable change in the structure of the Nigerian economy over time was the taking over by the oil sector from the agriculture as the leading sector of the economy. Direction of Nigeria's trade. Question regarding the destinations of a country's export and sources of its import matter for the country's trade policy, especially as it relates to regional and multilateral trade agreements whose negotiations are usually influenced by such questions. With respect to regional distribution of Nigeria's total trade, Western Europe has remained a dominant position followed by the Americas. The relative improvement in Nigeria's trade with the rest of Africans, especially in the 1990s, has not been significant enough to compete with Europe and America. Together, Europe and the United States accounted for 80%, 77%, and 73% of Nigeria's export in 1971, 1980, and 1995 respectively, while export to the rest of Africa stood at 22%, 3%, and 9.2% during those years. From the historical development of Nigeria, Nigeria's export contrasts sharply with that of the European Union's share. Nigeria's export to the Asian countries improved relatively in the 1990s and 2005, it near zero in 1960s and 1970s. The country's export to Asian countries increased to 6.3 in 1995 and 14% in 1998. In 2000 5, it rose to China. The relative improvement in Nigeria's export to the rest of Africa and Asia, especially in the late 1990s, also applies to its import from the two regions. From nearly 1% between 1971 and early 1990s, Nigerians from the rest of Africa increased to 2.8% and 3.7% in 1995 and 1998 respectively. It further rose to in the year 2000. Together, the countries of the European Union contributed 60%, 58%, and 51% of Nigerians' import in 1975, 1990, and 1995 respectively, while the United States accounted for 11%, 6.3%, and 12% during the respective period. In general, Nigeria's trade with the Middle East and the former communist states, especially Russia, has been highly insignificant. Question: why is it that Nigerian trade with the rest of African countries has not significantly improved over time? Feedback: the reason is that most African countries are net exporters of primary goods compared to their foreign counterparts who are exporters of finished products. Trade policies: Nigeria's trade policies have witnessed extreme swing from high protectionism in the first few decades after independence to its current more liberal stance. Tariffs at various times have been used to raise fiscal revenue, limit import available foreign exchange, or to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. Various forms of non-tariff barriers (NTBs), such as quotas, prohibitions, and licensing schemes, were also extensively used in the economy to limit the quantity of import of a particular good. Question: what do you understand by the word trade policy? Trade policy simply refers to a set of laws that relate to the exchange of goods or services involved in international trade, including taxes, subsidies, and import-export regulations. Balance of payments. The balance of payment account is the statement of transaction between the resident of a nation and the resident of other countries of the world. For most developing economies, part of the 1970s through the late 1990s were periods of severe external shocks and macroeconomic turbulence. Unlike most of the developing countries, the discovery of crude oil in commercial quantity in Nigeria and the positive influence of the oil shocks of the 1970s placed the economy on a track of prosperity. Massive inflow of oil revenue in the 1970s and 1980s earned Nigeria a place among the middle-income countries and easy access to international capital markets. The country, however, ran into structural crisis and severe balance of payment problems at the end of the position oil shocks. The weakness of the economy manifested as the country was unable to sustain the structure that emerged during the massive inflow of petrodollars. Then, severe balance of payment ensued. The country's balance of payment account recorded an annual average surplus in 1971 and 1974. The substantial surplus recorded during the period may be linked to the massive inflow of petrodollar during the positive oil shock experienced by major oil exports, including Nigeria at that time. The second half of the 1970s witnessed an annual average deficit of about $0.77 billion and 1979. Budgetary demands for sustaining the economic structures which emerged during the massive inflow of petrodollars into the economy may have led to the trend of deficit recorded during that period. The deficit on the account increased to annual average of 2.98 billion US dollars during the first half of 1990s and 1.93 billion US dollars during 1995 to 2000. Question: Rent, royalties, and profit of government transactions with the rest of the world falls under which balance of payment accounts? Feedback: They all fall under the current account transactions. Study section summary. In this study section, you learned that the countries of the world interact through the international economic system via the international trade. The rationale is based on the terms of comparative advantage, which states that a country will gain from trade if it produces and exchanges goods and services for which it has comparative advantage. The following terms concepts are peculiar with international transaction: terms of trade, balance of payment, comparative advantage and disadvantage, foreign sector trade policies, import and export of goods and services, and balance of trade, etc. Direction of trade refers to the destinations of a country's export and source of its import. Europe and the United States account for the highest trade volume of Nigeria. This is the end of study section 13. Thanks for listening.